really brief summary about what we just heard. And I posed it in the form of a question to the last speaker, but really it's a question to all of you, all of us sitting here, the global scientific community that works internationally with UNFCCC. Of course, that's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, says that if the global temperature rise hits 2 degrees centigrade, that's a tipping point and past the point of no return for many, many ecosystems. Some of the damage that's already happened is irreversible, like the melting of the Greenland glaciers and many glaciers around the world, which then warms the ocean, which raises the ocean level, but affects the weather and the climate all over the world in the farthest reaches. That can't be refrozen, we know that. But those temperature increases that the gentleman that just spoke here in the plains are well above that level, which the global scientists and even our own elders are saying is going to have a devastating impact on food systems, ecosystems, water level, like no more water, no more streams, and lakes, species becoming extinct, many of which are essential for our ecosystems. Like I showed the Sonora toad yesterday for our ecosystem. So the question is for all of us, what are we going to do? What is our responsibility to our children and our grandchildren, and Creator willing, their grandchildren? Um, and I think that that needs to be the focus. It's important, but I just wanted to make sure that those statistics, because a lot of times we get our eyes glass over with all these statistics, but what this means in terms of those of us that work on climate change, what we've already heard that it means. And that's why the temperature increase globally, the goal is no more than 1.5 degrees, as I said yesterday, above pre-industrial levels. This isn't above 20 years ago. This is above before they started making machines and factories and all that. 1.5 and 2 is the highest that it's supposed to be able to go. And a lot of places, as the scientist said, it's already reached more than that. So what does that mean? It means some pretty scary stuff from what I've heard. And I just wanted to recap that so that that sinks in and we can talk about what our responsibilities are, what our actions are going to be, what are we going to actually do. Of course, we're going to keep fighting the pipelines and the tar sands and the drilling and all that. But in the meanwhile, what are we going to do to adapt? We heard from a young man how they are storing their seeds like they always have done underground and focusing on drought resistant seeds. What are we doing here in this place to make sure that those kinds of measures are taken? What are we doing so that our buffalo, which is going to sustain you all in the coming time, not the stores, not the store-bought food, not the cattle for sure, they can't withstand these temperature changes. So I just wanted to say those words for the seriousness of what we're talking about, not just let those statistics go over our head, but think about what they mean. We're going to be hearing more about water, more about housing, more about buffalo restoration and how vital that really is to this discussion as we move into the next part of the conference. But I just wanted to kind of do a recap so that people will look at what we're already facing, not something's going to happen 20 years from now, but now and 20 years from now. So with that, I'll turn the floor back over and thank you for your attention. I know this isn't pleasant to hear, but it's not supposed to be. So let's get real and say what we're going to do. Thank you.
technology. It's great when it works. When it doesn't. Are we good? Good to go? Okay. Well, let's continue. It's my pleasure to introduce a friend and a colleague of mine for, I'm not going to say many years, but years. Uh, Her name is Laura Edwards. She's the South Dakota State University Extension specialist, but also she's our state climatologist. She's going to talk about what can we do to prepare for extreme weather conditions. Laura has been the state climatologist of South Dakota since 2017. Previously, she served as an extension climate field specialist in South Dakota and a research scientist in other regions. She works with many groups to use climate information in decision making from the individual to the state. So, with that, please welcome Laura Edwards. Okay, grab that. Push that in. Okay.
All right, thank you, James. Yeah, I don't know when we first met, but I've been in South Dakota for about 11 years almost now. So I've appreciated working with James over the many years that we've known each other. So today, the topic they asked me to talk about was preparing for weather and climate extremes. That's a very broad topic, and they gave me essentially a laundry list of things to consider. So I'll go through many of those here, but I do want to say that mitigation or adaptation is really local. You know your own risks, your own vulnerabilities, or where you're vulnerable to different hazards, um, and what kind of information you have, your access to updates of information, things like that, data to support those decisions. And so a lot of this comes down to your local level and your local decision makers and what you have available or can't make available. And like James said earlier this morning, this is really very a Western view. And so I just acknowledge that, but I'm happy to answer questions along the way, um, either through the presentation or at the end. Just this last summer, I crossed the Missouri River at Fort Randall, and now I've crossed the river at Avery Dam and Bridge that goes across the river in South Dakota. And so I took a picture there, and being here with you reminded me of that time. I do want to also acknowledge the land here that you all were here first before people like me. My ancestors come from China and French Canada, so a very different background than you all, and I appreciate the invitation to be here today. Um, Earlier this morning, we had remarks that say that the native people here did not write down a lot, and the oral tradition is strong, and I do appreciate that. But we do have some written records of climate extremes and other eventful, other things of high impact that have occurred in the history of this region. And so we do use these on occasion to describe prehistoric or events of climate history before we started taking daily temperature precipitation measurements, in 1880s, 1890s. So just kind of overview of some climate impacts for South Dakota. Imtiaz, just before me, covered quite a bit of this, and I think he described very well the climate trends and projections and extremes, in particular the swings that we see and the increase in precipitation in general. He did try to describe too, and I think he did okay on this too, that our winter temperatures are warming faster than any other season. Summer temperatures, he remember showed heat events, the frequency of high heat events, maybe aren't increasing as much in the summer, and that our number of extreme cold events in the winter are decreasing. And so we're seeing, granted, warming on an annual scale, but more of that is concentrated in the winter than any other season. What does that mean for impacts? Well, that means warmer winters increases potential of overwintering for some pest insects, for example. Um, Maybe some plant disease that are maybe in the soil that benefit from warmer soil temperatures. And we also have a longer frost-free season, which I'll talk about a little bit later, that has several different impacts, both good and bad, I'd say, positive and negative. The combination of wetter and warmer conditions also allows a more favorable environment for some of these pests, and especially in the agricultural setting, which is where I spend most of my time in extension. Um, we see warmer and wetter conditions favor plant disease, um, and also though favors plant growth and vegetation growth. So you see more biomass, more plant material growing faster. But there's pros and cons to that, right? Same goes for weeds, not just the thing that you want to grow, for example. So also with dried periods, though, too, we see different kinds of insects and disease issues in dry times, such as this year. The grasshopper infestation was about as large as we've seen in about a decade. So we do see other concerns in dry times. And over a long period of time, I know this statement sounds vague, but I think there's a lot we don't know as far as how are different species going to adapt to these very rapid changes between wet and dry times, having more extreme rainfall events in general, being warmer in some seasons, having warmer overnight temperatures, things like that. We don't know exactly everything that will adapt very well. Also thinking of kind of the wooded areas that you hear in the Black Hills in particular. A very dynamic, complicated situation there, where it can affect how much snow is captured, for example, which leads to how much water and runoff we have in the warm season, right? And so there's having the forest and plains both in our region can make that a little more complicated, where the plains region, water-wise anyway, generally depends more on spring and summer rainfall. But we have a snow melt driven system in the Missouri River with snow in the Rocky Mountains, and here locally, snow in the Black Hills that drives some of the rivers, reservoirs, and irrigation systems. So think though that we'll see more frequent dry times in between these heavier wet times. And then also changes in fire regimes, which I'll talk about a little bit later as well. We have a very excellent state wildland fire meteorologist here in Rapid City, Dr. Darren Clabo at the School of Mines. And he's done a lot of work on climate connections to large wildland fire occurrences. And really now, he would say that we're now facing a 12-month fire season. We're not limited to the shoulder seasons or the warm season. We're seeing large fires all year round. We saw the Legion Lake fire, which happened in the month of December following a severe drought. And we've seen other big fires occur in what would historically have been the off season for fire. So the Black Hills here, as far as climate projections go and historical trends, has behaved a little bit differently than the plains part of at least South Dakota. And in general, the annual temperature is warming, just as Imtiaz has said before. Winter is still warming at a higher rate than any other season, but we sometimes see in the summer even like no trend or maybe slightly cooling. And what's different here than elsewhere is that our daytime maximum temperatures and our overnight minimum temperatures are rising at about the same rate in the Black Hills. Further east on the plains, for most of the rest of the state, it's our minimum temperatures that are rising faster than the daytime temperatures. And so that's kind of a different characteristic that historically, at least, we've seen here in the Black Hills. Where on the plains, it's really the minimum temperatures that's driving our average temperatures warmer. And here too in the hills, annual precipitation is increasing. And as MTS showed earlier, parts of South Dakota are getting wetter faster than almost anywhere else in the country, if you look at percentage increase. And he showed some newer data even than what I typically show, but that's been a trend the last decade or so, where we've seen recently this part of the country getting wetter faster than most anywhere else. Here in the Black Hills, most of that increase is coming in the fall season, but it's highly variable. We see a lot of ups and downs in all the seasons. And winter season precipitation, again, thinking of this area as being the snow capture zone for rivers and irrigation systems and so on. Winter precipitation has been decreasing, and so that's curious, and that's a little bit different impact. Where MTS did show we are seeing increases in snow in a lot of the area too, and I think we're starting to see kind of a movement towards wetter winter seasons in general in this part of the country. Um, the National Climate Assessment. I don't know if someone has presented parts of this before. They're currently in writing the next draft of this that I believe will be open for public comment towards the end of the year. So I encourage you all to take a look at that if you see those announcements come out. And I believe they'll have a fairly long window for public comment. But this is from the last National Climate Assessment in the chapter that focuses on the Northern Great Plains, and they did have some tribal adaptation pieces there. And I know the font is very small, but I just wanted to bring your attention to that they have described some of the impacts that they had identified back then. This is in 2018 when this report was published, and that they are updating this, and they really want to hear and know what is going on Native lands in Indian country. The authors of the National Climate Assessment. So getting into climate adaptation and being able to plan for and be ready for climate and weather, I'll call weather extremes too. There's a really great toolkit out there called the Climate Resilience Toolkit. I only know this because I was one of the curators, one of the people who helped collect resources for this group of resources. We have a section here for the Northern Great Plains that we finalized last year. And we had a lot of people from across the region, including Stefan Tangent from the CASC and some others helping to represent tribal interests. And so there are some resources here that are purely focused on the Northern Great Plains. But there are a lot of other resources there too that maybe were developed or created in other regions, but could be applied here to our area. And some are just national resources that are just broad for everybody. So I encourage you to take a look at that and see if there's anything that might be helpful for you. Again, thinking of planning and climate resilience, this is one of the places that I send people to first, at least, to really just get a whole breadth of what might be available out there before you start tackling creating your own and doing your own process. So having a plan. A lot of people more recently have been asking me about drought, in particular in South Dakota. And I know it's been, we're now in our third year of drought, and it's been ebbing and flowing and very extreme at times, and currently is in some places. As far as tribal interests go, having your FEMA all hazard plan is a start. And I know there's been a lot of work there, sometimes with coordinating with the county, but sometimes doing it on your own. I will say in my experience, I also sit on the state's hazard mitigation team, and where the state's FEMA all hazard plan is revised, which includes a drought plan as an appendix. So they actually have a separate, currently, at least currently, they have a separate drought plan in addition to their all hazard plan. And there's kind of some bonus brownie points if you include climate change hazards or risks in your FEMA all hazard plan. And there's a financial incentive to do that, at least at the state level. So I encourage you to take that as maybe your first step, because that covers a lot of weather hazards. Not drought so much. That's partly why we have a drought plan separately. But a lot of like severe weather, winter storms, tornadoes, flooding, a lot of those kinds of things that cause a lot of infrastructure damage. That's kind of FEMA's sweet spot, is when there's infrastructure damage involved. There are hazard mitigation funds from the state, and I believe some tribes have used those funds in maybe cost sharing, construction of tornado safe shelters, things like that. That's what I've seen when I've in the years that I've sat on the hazard mitigation team. But they have both planning and implementation funds available at times. So I encourage you to check that out, contact the state office, and peer to kind of find out their timelines and deadlines for some of those applications. And sometimes they have funds available after a disaster occurs. There's some pot of money set aside for mitigation of any hazard. So, for example, there was a big ice storm on Christmas some years ago. Percentage of that money is set aside for mitigation for any hazard. It doesn't have to be an ice storm. And so think of that too after there's disasters. The derechos, for example, last year or earlier this year. Developing a drought action plan. And I specifically put in the word action. I will admit our state drought plan doesn't have a lot of action in it. When it comes down to action, we have a shorter document called the incident annex, and that's what we follow typically when there's drought. And that's what governs our state drought task force and those kinds of things. But there's a lot of questions there. I have a couple here to consider, but I'll go into drought a little bit later too. Drought is a kind of a difficult thing because it's not well forecasted, at least not currently. It can be short-term, long-term. It can come on quickly. It can come on slow. It can last a few months. It can last a few years. It's very difficult to plan for drought. But I think there are some structures that we can recommend and advise to plan for drought. And underlying all of this is communication. Having your core team of people you check in with regularly, whether or not there's a disaster in place or forecasted. Have that team of people who can help share your message out, who can agree on your plan together, who you can work with and revise occasionally as well. You can't just have a plan and have it sit on the shelf. South Dakota was one of the first states to have a drought plan, I believe, in 1985, and it sat there until about 2016. So I know there's some groups up in, I believe it was Fort Peck Indian community in northern Montana. They have a drought plan, but it's using climate indices, climate data that's not available anymore. So they need to revise their drought plan because their information is no longer available to identify the drought situation. So drought preparation, this is the current U.S. drought monitor. I'm guessing maybe Doug or somebody shared this yesterday. Certainly it's affecting a lot of tribal areas, Yankton Sioux Tribe, Pine Ridge, Rosebud to some extent, and some others. We've had quite a big turnaround this last fall, last 6 to 8 weeks. This is kind of a funny graphic that Dr. Wilhite from the National Drought Mitigation Center has shared over the years, called the hydrological cycle, not the hydrological cycle, where you can get into this system where you're concerned about drought in the top left there, and then all of a sudden you're in drought and you're panicking. And then you have rain, and then you're like, oh, well, it can ease up a little bit. And then you kind of don't care for a little while into the apathy stage, and then you experience drought again, and then you're aware of it again, and and it's hard to fit in where do you start writing a plan? We always recommend, it is always recommended start a drought plan when you're not in drought. But then, you could be in flood. So when do you start your flood plan, right? So I know it's difficult, but um, there, it's never a bad time to start a drought plan, I would say. Um, but when you were thinking of putting together a plan for drought, which again is admittedly complicated, a lot of things to consider. I've heard a lot of references to buffalo production, raising buffalo for benefits of the landscape, ecosystem, cultural and social reasons. That's all important. Cattle and sheep too. You got to worry about food and water, both heat stress and cold stress, and we have some tools that help with that with our weather station network. Water, of course, water is life to both animals and people and the landscape and everything. But we're looking at supply and water quality both in this scenario of drought. A lot of health aspects here that there's a really great scientist, Dr. Jesse Bill, down in Nebraska, who's worked a lot. He used to be at CDC, and he works a lot with health impacts from drought. And we have someone at SDSU too who's looking at mental health during drought or climate extremes as well. But that can affect both your physical health due to maybe poor quality water, but also maybe air quality and other environmental issues, which I'll talk about a little bit. Drought also affecting garden and local food productions. I know there's a lot more movement on tribal lands to create and build local food production and communities for that. And so, of course, drought can affect that like anyone else. Small businesses, tourism, I know at the state level, when there's drought like 2017, there's a lot of word getting out about this extreme drought in South Dakota, high fire risk everywhere. And the tourism department did a lot of marketing, a lot of promotion on all the benefits of coming to South Dakota during that time. Trying to, and this is where your communication, your team has a role in communicating what are all the good things that are happening in the area, in the community, including small businesses. What can they do, and how can they help kind of fill in some holes or help address problems that may arise during drought? Yeah. Oh, might need a microphone. I'm sorry. Oh, yep. You got one. Oh, hi. Yeah.
One of our subjects was for the tribes to exercise their sovereignty, that we wanted to look at doing a drought protocol. Is this the drought protocol right here?
Yep, this could be part of that. Absolutely. Yep.
What we want to do is we sat down amongst ourselves at that time with the federal agencies. I think we had USDA, a few other ones there at that time. But we're trying to do what you're just saying right here is develop a protocol on a nation-to-nation basis with the tribes and then working with federal agencies. But my question is, we do get this protocol, and we get a protocol for a declaration. Can you kind of elaborate on if we do a tribal declaration to an agency, with the assistance that comes from that agency, would it be for these topics like you mentioned it up there? Have you guys on the state level, what do they provide assistance for?
So the state does very little financially when there's drought, to be honest, as compared to some other states. One thing we do is if there's large risk of wildland fire, we'll financially support the Type 1 response aircraft for aircraft attack on wildland fire. They also, this year, and I think several droughts previously, eased up transportation rules for hauling of feed for livestock things like that with the highway safety folks. But they're in my years of experience on the drought task force, they haven't provided any financial anything to anyone in particular. In 2017, they did work with USD Department of Ag to open up haying on highway ditches and early release of conservation land for grazing in a drought situation. So those are the kinds of things that the state has done. But again, not a lot of financial support really in any way.
I know we do have a drought adaptation plan, and I know the other tribes do too, but right now we're taking it on to another level, which is the drought action plan. And maybe, I think I notified you about a meeting that we had, but we're gonna follow up and continue on until we develop a action plan. And then the different federal agencies have different criteria, like you said, FEMA, drought monitor, USDA, agriculture, FSA, these are federal agencies, but we need to strategize our tribal direction to address them, because at the Oglala Lakota level with us, we do declarations, but they're never honored or nothing by the states, because we're a sovereign nation, but every county around us gets their declarations, some kind of assistance, but we don't. So our focus is working with us and the federal agencies to get a communication. And I know one thing this past summer, even to this day, is that there's been lack of precipitation, and that should be a qualifier for a drought. And right now, you just showed that we're in an extreme. So I think we need to develop an action plan where we could go to like the level extreme on the drought monitor, and then have measures that we could take for water restrictions, water conservation. And I'd like to see if you could assist us with that in the future. Okay?
Yeah, I would love to. And I did call into your Zoom meeting there that you had a couple weeks ago. But I know, yeah, James or Mr. Rattling Leaf has done excellent work laying the groundwork for you with your drought vulnerability assessments with the four tribes with the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance. So I believe that was 2017 when we had quite severe drought in some areas. So yeah, you have some excellent groundwork started. Yeah, and I'll say with USDA, a lot of the drought disaster information is tied to the Farm Bill. And they are currently now talking about the next Farm Bill. So I would urge you to reach out to your representatives in Congress and the senators for that, because they're having those discussions now. And I know they've been talking to some groups this summer for that. So a lot of that is tied into the Farm Bill. Yes. Oh, yeah. You got the mic. Okay.
I work for the Lawsuit Tribal Education Agency.
Okay.
I have a question and I guess a request from you.
Okay.
After hearing Cousin Grino for a couple of days now, and all the time before, let's be frank, it sounds like the state will not recognize what our tribes are doing, and their protocol, I know them, is going to meet or exceed the state's. So if the state is not going to contribute financially, can they not stand beside the tribes, develop some kind of written protocol that once our declarations are done, it would automatically almost be supported by the state? There, the state still sits by not helping financially, but it may help with our federal agencies.
Well, I'm not a state employee, so I can't speak entirely for the state government side. Yeah, I guess I can't answer that definitively. I'm not sure what the state offices, the governor's office in particular, currently would want to do. getting back to U.S. Department of Agriculture, where a lot of our drought is defined by agriculture here in South Dakota, those drought declarations are made no longer at the county or state level. And that is where the Farm Bill comes in, because that's what has defined to get a USDA secretarial disaster declaration. Your county has to be in, I believe, D3 or worse on the U.S. drought There's some criteria written into the Farm Bill, essentially. Since 2008, I think that's been in place, or just after. So, yeah, when it comes to agriculture, at least, that decision is no longer made at the county or state level. That's automatic triggered by other indicators.
Okay. So what can you do to recommend a procedure that we won't have to fight with the state on every event?
Yeah, I'm happy to be at the table and help facilitate that conversation. And I believe, yeah, you all should be heard, as well as any other county or entity in the state, absolutely. As far as actions in a drought at the state level, I've mentioned the state drought task force, but really it's a coordinating communication kind of thing. There's representatives from each of the state agencies, National Weather Service, myself, and the state fire, wildland fire meteorologist, USDA, but they don't vote a lot. They don't take a lot of action, I'll say. It's really just coordinating, communicating. What are you guys doing? What do you plan to do? That kind of thing. But yeah, we could certainly talk more offline. I'm just trying to brainstorm on the fly here. What's a good avenue for that, and where can that fit in, Doug? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there's a question in the back table. Hi. Hi. Yeah. Hi, Paula. Yeah.
I was going to ask you is exactly about the drought task force. You know, what is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And one of my questions is, you know, developing the goals and objectives of your task force. Can you suggest to include tribal involvement? You know, because that, to me, that would be an important step too, is to get tribal involvement on that task force, because we have people like Reno and Syed and Great Plains Water, you know, Great Plains Water Lines that can contribute enormously to that task force, because, you know, with the combined number of acres that all the tribal, you know, all the reservations have, we do have a big chunk of grasslands, and we are being affected by drought, just like everybody else. But, you know, having a seat at that table would be important too. And I just want to thank you for your great information.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Paula. I agree, and I will make that request. The Drought Task Force is co-chaired by Department of Public Safety and Department of Ag and Natural Resources. One representative from each of those organizations. So, but I feel I can make that request. So
Maybe you can let some of the tribal people know if they need to make a formal, you know, request as, you know, tribal governments or however, you know.
Okay. Okay. Yep.
I'd like to interject something.
Oh, Phil. Hi.
I want to remind my relatives here that coming from a treaty perspective, our treaty is with the United States government, and we have a nation-to-nation relationship. So we don't work with the state.
I mean, that's my opinion or position. We are sovereign, so that means that we can create these things ourselves. We have to start thinking sovereign. Don't rely on the state. We can do this ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. I do need to move on a little bit. James is going to give me the hook here in a minute. On this slide here, I just want to say that SDSU Extension, who I work for, and the National Drought Mitigation Center, USDA, a lot of us have resources in drought planning from the individual farm or ranch level through communities up through state level drought plans. We have experience and examples that we can bring forth for you to help with that process if you so desire. So please do reach out. And if I can't do it, I can help find somebody who can help walk you through. This is a couple examples from the Drought Mitigation Center and the drought ready communities and managing drought risk on the ranch, which actually has some South Dakota specific examples actually in there as well. So they're really great guidebooks. I call them workbooks to help you think through some things when you're thinking about drought planning. I will say when it comes to drought, I cannot overemphasize how important monitoring is. Knowing what your normal conditions are and keeping track some way, however that is, of where you are compared to normal, whether it be precipitation, temperature, how much sage you've pulled, how many, potatoes you've been able to find out in the wild, things like that, all help in identifying when you're seeing drought and how severe it is. Human health, and I mentioned that Jesse Bill at Nebraska and Dr. Andrea Bjornstead at South Dakota have worked a lot on the mental health and physical health part of this. I was just yesterday. The reason why I wasn't here yesterday is
Where's our microphones? He needs one and I need one.
Use the one hand.
Oh, there you go. Is that muted? Is that muted? Okay. So the reason why I wasn't here yesterday is because yesterday in Aberdeen they had their annual West Nile and mosquito control conference, and this is a human health issue in times of drought. The way I identify it, anyway. So this was 2021, last year. The dotted line is the typical kind of numbers of West Nile cases, which is carried by a specific species of mosquitoes that generally emerges in the mid-summer season, not the early season. And so we tend to see more West Nile cases in the August timeframe, generally later summer. That was very typical in 2021, which generally had dry conditions, a lot of the state, particularly the eastern side, where we see more West Nile in general. But this year, very different, where we had a late flush in September, October, actually, of West Nile cases. And so this is kind of building off of something MTS said too, where we're seeing more of the wetter springs transitioning to drier summers. That's what he's seen in some of the projections. That's exactly what we had this year. We had early cool and wet, especially in the north. We've kind of been dry in the south the whole time. Early cool and wet in the north in particular, and dry and warm almost everywhere late summer. Building up that mosquito habitat. They tend to concentrate in stagnant pools of water. And so when there's plentiful water, actually, the West Nile virus is not as prevalent. It tends to be more during drought times that we see that specific species of mosquito carry disease. So another thing to think about on the health side. Getting into some other extremes, I have like 4 minutes. Flooding. two kinds of flooding. One is kind of our spring flooding that we see due to snowmelt, which could be in the plains or the mountains. This was March 2019, the James River in eastern. So this is taking off courtesy of Delta Airlines out of Aberdeen, and I took a picture from the plane of the James River, and you could see the floodplain. For those of you who aren't as familiar with that, the elevation change on the James River is about 1 foot per mile. Very, very flat. And so that was March 27th. About a week and a half later, 2 weeks later, April 5th, it was all melted. This is the road near our place where we live on the farm. And all that snow had melted and overland flooded. And as you know now, there's a lot of flooding out here too. The Cheyenne, White, various rivers. And it didn't just end there. 2019 ended up being the record wettest year statewide, heads and shoulders above 1915, to their previous state record anyway. So we've seen, even local flooding history, but certainly 2019 on Rosebud was one of them, on the White River as well, as I mentioned. So we're also seeing increasing in flash flooding, and preparing for that is very difficult because they're very short term. It's really like the National Weather Service issuing a flash flood warning, where you see a heavy rain event that can drive flooding very quickly, and then it goes away. But keeping in mind, you could still have that short-term drought in between these heavy rainfall events. But we're seeing an increase in these heavy rain events. It's very difficult outside of, protecting your homes, your structures, elevating, what you can out of the floodplain. But I know some of your, tribal, traditional communities are residing in the floodplain, and that's very difficult to move. I know a whole community, you wouldn't want to do that. We've seen events recently in 2018 in Brookings, that red dot there at Aurora, 8.87 in one single day, just east of Brookings. Up in Brown County, just 2 years ago, saw 14 inches in a day, basically an evening, and overnight. 14 inches of rain at the Elm Lake, that's the river and the dam. The lake, the dam, the river, that river flooded for about a week because, again, it moves real slow as it feeds into the James. But very difficult to prepare for these, other than having your infrastructure prepared for a potential high runoff event. Frost freeze season. I did want to mention this because of the impacts that we see. More generations of insects per season. Like this year in grasshoppers, the entomologists I work with, when's the first freeze? When's the first freeze? We need to kill these guys. The longer that season is, you get another generation. I believe they had 3 generations maybe this season. Second year drought, you may see the blister beetles because they follow on the grasshoppers. Those can be very harmful to horses, for example, and hay and animal feed, those kinds of things. Also, you see maybe a late flush of weeds. Again, with that extended growing season, especially in the agriculture or yard and garden setting, you have those herbicides that can work for a while, but then you get that late flush in the late summer or fall that typically get killed with a frost. But if you have a really late frost, they kind of hang on for a little longer and they're harder to control. But upsides, higher potential for yields for food, for gardens, for crops, and those kinds of things. What is really interesting, and I won't dwell, I have some graphics to show this, but I'll say this point. We're seeing a shorter window in the spring season, between the last hard frost day, say 26 to 28 degrees, and the 32 or 35 degree. So that time between the last hard frost temperature, very cold temperature below freezing, to the melting point, the number of days there is shrinking in the spring. So that's offering a shorter window for snowmelt, with the potential for higher, faster snowmelt, causing more flooding in the spring. Okay. We also see that in the fall. I don't know that that's so much of a factor, but we're seeing that shorter window between when we see 32 degrees to that hard freeze. Fewer days in between. But it's really erratic when we see when we see that first frost in the fall or that last frost in the spring. They're kind of all over the board. MTS kind of touched on this, the extended growing seasons. Here in the western part of the state, this is an example from Lawrence County, we're seeing the last spring occur earlier and the first fall occur later, about the same rate. But up in the northeastern part of the state where I am, we're seeing slightly earlier spring frost, but our fall frosts are going way later, faster than the earlier spring. So they're not evenly spaced on the spring and fall as far as the frost-free season goes. Severe weather. Oh, but that's a tough one. There's a lot of hazards there to consider. National Weather Service, we got Dave Hintz here. He and his staff do the best job they can forecasting. Their job is to protect life and property. And they're the ones that you want to look out for when there's severe weather potentially on the way. Winter storms to summer storms. Carrying insurance is one of those things that I think is one of those hazard protection strategies. I know storm shelters people like to have. I know they're pretty expensive, and finding a good place for them in the community is sometimes challenging. But that's one way to help. Certainly, the derecho out in eastern South Dakota, I believe, went over Flandreau Santee Sioux Tribes area, but affected all the I-29 corridor, north and south. This was captured on our webcam at the Brookings weather station on campus of SDSU, where we saw the derecho coming in. We have some neat time-lapse pictures there, but caused quite a bit of destruction, and that's very hard. We see a derecho, a couple derechos about every 2 years. Pine Ridge had a derecho in 2020. We've had 2 out in the eastern part of the state, but this year, but they're not every year. And winter snowstorms. I just bring this up, the October 2013 blizzard affected cattle losses, right, very significantly. But I bring this up because I distinctly remember at the time hearing the comment that of people saying even the buffalo died, as they are very resilient to these kinds of extremes typically, and that this kind of event, although it's forecast in the weather sense, we only had a couple days forecast, very high impact though. And some things are just so extreme, they're difficult to manage. Wildfire, I think we talked about that a little bit. I want to touch on the Mesonet. I believe maybe someone shared already that the Mesonet, our weather station network at SDSU, is translated into Lakota. And so you can see that either in English or Lakota on the website. The weather data coming out of these weather stations is updated every 5 minutes. So we measure all of these things, air temperature, pressure. We even have snow depth sensors. We have rulers and webcams to verify the snow measurement. And we also have webcams to kind of, that they can move around to verify and make sure the equipment's working, but they also can get those cool landscape pictures. Precipitation is one of the biggest investments there. They're melting the snow as it falls. They're getting total rain, total precipitation all year round now at all the upgraded and new installed stations. That's a very hefty investment, but the idea of this network and the expansion that they're undergoing right now is to improve flood forecasting in the upper Missouri River Basin. So they were doing everything they can to measure soil moisture and total precipitation across the upper Missouri River Basin, which leads to all the soil sensors. They have 5 soil sensors and bunch of other things. I want to share, this is where all the stations are currently. 2 brand new ones over the weekend, Milesville and Hayes, in the central to western part of the state. I believe very soon They're coming up with a station in far western Millette County. I'm going to say right there. And I know they have plans to expand on tribal lands too. I know they've been working with Reno and others. There's a station at Flandreau already, and a couple up at Standing Rock and Rosebud. So they're working hard with tribal partners to instrument that. I will say they're looking to fill in all these blue areas. They have about 44 stations right now. Their plan is to build out to over 150 in basically 5 years. Who's paying for that? The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is paying for that. So, in partnership with NOAA to help with data for their flood forecasting. So, they have invested a lot into flood monitoring and improving their data so they can better forecast for this entire basin. Includes many other states. The whole entire basin will have about 540 stations that look like the one that I showed you. So, yes.
On that map. How can we get Rosebud on that map?
I would contact that TV meteorologist and ask them to add it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because I think they know about it, but they may or may not use it all the time. Yep. The National Weather Service, I do know, will look at the data from here, and when you see those summaries, of extreme cold recently, they include mesonet in their weather data reports. Yeah. Yeah, might have to contact the TV. I know there's been some turnover here in the Rapid City area on TV. So.
Do we have a camera in Mission on that weather station?
I don't think at Mission.
Can we get one?
Or at Rosebud?
Yeah.
At Rosebud?
Yeah.
I think Syed. Where's Syed? Yeah. I think they're gonna get one if they don't have one yet.
Syed, we're gonna get one.
Yeah. All the upgrades will have webcams. Yeah. So I'll skip other. I also have a list of resources. I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with anybody. And thank you for your time. I'll leave my contact information up. If people want to write down my name, phone number, I'm on Twitter too. So thank you, James.
I just have one closing comment, James. I'd like my relatives here, the Oceti, Sakowin, to Reno and Syed. Let's think about putting up our own drought monitor that includes all the reservations, and we're going to tell the U.S. government how we feel, what we think is a drought on our homelands. That's how you use your sovereignty. Let's not ask the state of South Dakota to please include us. No, we're going to do it ourselves. Thank you.
Well, thank you again. Thank you, Laura Edwards, for that great presentation. We're going to move on now to Vivian Delgado. But in the meantime, Joaquin Luta would like to share a song with us before we move on to Vivian. Stretch break. Stretch break. Thank you, Wankia.
Quick announcement.
Go ahead.
Um, we're going to be working on a survey. What do you call that? Evaluation. At the end of the conference, should be able to email it to you and get your responses on this conference, so we can keep improving on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Our next presenter will be Dr. Vivian Delgado. She's from the International Indian Treaty Council. She's Yaqui and Tewa. She'll be speaking on immigration statistics in South Dakota. Dr. Delgado's professional background is in indigenous philosophy and higher education. She wrote, developed, and taught decolonizing curriculum in indigenous studies and social justice. Indigenous science is a term that she uses interchangeably with indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge. At the heart of her work is her attempt to bring consciousness to all people about natural law, which is the foundation of indigenous science, traditional governments, and treaty work. So please welcome Dr. Delgado. Vivian.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Los Chinia, Kichialia, Inipo, Vivian Delgado, Tite Ek, Haamidakiapi, Wase Wakawia, Hamia, Shantewashte Iuha, Ichichia Pia. I want to thank JC and Andrea and Phil for giving me the opportunity to have a few words here today. I've thought a lot about what I wanted to talk about. And so at the heart of my work, I'm a philosopher, and I think very deeply about everything that we do. I think deeply about the environment, the earth, and all of the things that make us who we are. So bear with me, and we'll get through this. So in my introduction, I want to discuss the impacts of immigration and migration in South Dakota and what impact that has on the motherland and the resources. As we know, as the population increases, there's more wear and tear on the land and the resources, and there's more that we have to put out to provide. Immigration, though, is a process through which people from other countries come here to take permanent residency. And migration is like a natural form of movement, and it's always been that way among Indigenous people. We were always free to come and go and visit other people in their homelands. The borders were never an issue when this was still Turtle Island. We still had that freedom and the opportunity to go back and forth. And in that migration, we always honored and recognized the land, the homeland of the original people there and their traditional laws and governments. And when we lived among them, we lived according to their cultures. So this is not something that's typical in Western America. Also, in contrast, Indigenous natives primarily journeyed to Europe as visiting dignitaries, willing or unwilling travelers and slaves. Historically, for most Indigenous people, the thought of immigrating to a foreign country was not natural. So you've never really seen any real movement from Native people from the United States going to Europe or any other foreign country to take a permanent residency. So some of this information I got from local information. South Dakota is on the rise in the top migration list. The growth rates are calculated by the gain of one-way U-Haul trucks entering the state in a calendar year. So, and that means that if people rent trucks one way, meaning that they're planning to move here to stay here. South Dakota's fastest growing cities are Sioux Falls, Rapid City, Spearfish, Hot Springs, Sturgis, and Yankton. Rapid City is not only in the top 8% in the nation, but the fastest growing metro area in the Midwest. From 2020 to 2021, Rapid City grew by 1.9%, triple the national average of 0.35%. So that probably doesn't mean a lot to people who don't live in South Dakota, but if you live in South Dakota and Rapid City, you probably can feel the encroachment of people. I know yesterday I was on my way to the airport because my luggage was lost, and there's a lot of construction going on the roads out there all the time. And it made me wonder about, you live so close to the Black Hills, and the Black Hills are sacred. It makes me wonder how the earth feels, because the earth has feelings too. And I know in our culture in the Southwest, among the Taos Pueblo people, we were always warned and advised to not walk on the ground when the grass is first coming up from the dirt, from the soil, even if you have moccasins on, because the earth could feel that. So you go around, and then I think about all of the invasive ways that we develop cities and bring people here. It's a tremendous, tremendous weight on the people who live here. Somehow we need to communicate to whoever that a lot of this migration and immigration to our country is not acceptable. So there's issues for current migrations and immigrations. Some of them include, obviously, shortage of housing, the politics, language barriers, access to medical services, transportation issues, cultural differences, raising children, prejudice, to name a few. So I know that some of these are hard topics to talk about, especially when we talk about racism and prejudice, which is alive and well in South Dakota. So when they gather these statistics, all of that kind of information is conveniently left out of the equation. But if you are Native, and it doesn't matter from what tribe, and you live in South Dakota, you will experience prejudice and some form of discrimination at some point in your stay in the state. Other disadvantages and issues of living in South Dakota are low wages and salaries. South Dakota ranks in the bottom half of all states based on median household incomes. That means in relationship to what other people earn nationally, South Dakota is only like halfway there. I think it's because there's not that much industry and there's not that many employment opportunities. So in 2000, 93.65%, or 658,245 of South Dakota's residents spoke English as their first language. So, and if you are one of the people that is concerned about Native culture and Native language, then you know that your own Native language is being dominated by English. And I think that this is an important topic because if you ever go to Hawaii and visit there, they almost completely lost their language and now they're at 93% fluency because they permeated their cities with their Hawaiian language. Like on the buses, you'll hear language in all the transportations. You'll hear even Hawaiian in Walmart. You can hear Hawaiian language in the hospitals. They just permeated their city with their language. I think that could be something that could be done in Rapid City as part of the solution to all of these other issues that we're experiencing. We know that in order to really embrace the land that we're on, that the language has to be a primary part of it. Also, South Dakota is known for its tourism and agriculture, and I think everyone who's a Native in this state is aware of the influx of tourism to the Black Hills, Mount Rushmore, Crazy Horse Monument, those kinds of things, and then the agriculture. I'm going to get a little bit more into the agriculture in another slide. South Dakota's population share, the white is 79.6%. American Indian, Alaska Native is only 8.4%. So, and that should be a red flag for everybody because instead of Native populations growing and flourishing, we're still at the very bottom of the population growth. So whatever you hear from statistics, especially like clinics and government agencies, that we have an overabundance of babies being born and things like that, it's not true. We need to have more Native people. There's already not enough Native people in this country to go around, and we can't afford to lose anybody or lose track of our population. And then in some of these statistics, there are Native people who don't want to cooperate with data collection. They don't want to be a statistic, so maybe they're not counted in that number. So in 2018, 35,175 immigrants, foreign-born, comprised 4% of the population in South Dakota. Now that doesn't include the recent immigration coming into South Dakota and the United States from the Ukraine. I did see in the newspaper a good number of those folks are coming to South Dakota. So that would be another thing, of concern maybe, because we see that already the ethnic groups that settled in South Dakota include Germans, Norwegians, Dutch, Danes, Russians, and Irish primarily in Vicksburg Eureka, Tabor, and Lake Hendricks. A patchwork of European ethnic settlement colors the history of South Dakota. And that's never really brought up. You know, if you look at any of the curriculum in any of the schools and in higher education, the percentage of the white population is never brought up. It's always compared to something else, like to deviate away from the dominance. And then in contrast, the entire state of South Dakota has a total of 77,116 square miles, of which 12% are reservation or trust lands. Census data puts the state population at 812,383. A conservative estimate places the number of Native American residents at 68,976, which is only 8.57%. And this statistic was taken in March of 2022. Again, you know, I think that we should be concerned about our population numbers and start asking why those numbers aren't growing. You know, we already know that we have a lower life expectancy, so we need to be looking at birth rates and what happens to the population of people that are indigenous here. So there's factors of race on immigration and migration in South Dakota as well. In the white population 2020 census, the white population remained the largest race or ethnicity group in the US, with 204.3 million people identifying as white alone. So you think about that. You know, when I was younger, we used to travel and just go from reservation to reservation. All the towns in between were like foreign countries because you didn't see Native people. You didn't see, you only seen white people. But you think about, you know, this is our country and this is where we come from, then where are all the people? I finally took a trip, first time out of the country to Guatemala. And when we landed at the airport and got off, the only people you see are brown people. And that was like a real flash for me because I thought I wasn't used to that. I think that we've conditioned ourselves to live and work among the white population without thinking about, you know, where are our people? We always talk about our people. Where are they? Are we really that few in number? We should be asking ourselves that. And then overall, there's 235.4 million people reported white alone or in combination with another group. So that particular racial group is growing, and we're not. So that should be another concern. The most common age among whites in the US is 58, more than double that of racial and ethnic minorities. And then I thought, just as a side note, threw this in for interest, the DNA study finds that Aboriginal Australians are the world's oldest civilization. And we talked a little bit about different groups of people yesterday, and I thought that was kind of an interesting thing to throw in there. Factors on immigration and agriculture in South Dakota. According to the American Immigration Council, immigrants make up 7% of all workers in farming, fishing, and forestry in South Dakota. Their labor is strongly linked to food prices. So I know that everyone's been talking about inflation. I was really shocked to see how much the gas in Rapid City costs. It's about $3.99 a gallon. Where I'm at in Colorado, we're still probably about $3.49 to $3.37 a gallon. So, and you put that on top of the rising food costs here, and then the unemployment, and then the low income of salaries per household. You know, how is everybody expected to live? It's just unbelievable. So then, and then we know that labor is strongly linked to food prices. And that was a 2022 statistic. And so we look at who is the labor, where are they, and who are they? We know that there are a lot of people that come here to work in the fields that are from Mexico, Central, and South America. But they have trouble. If you get into the data and look at what they have to do to be here, there's like a special pot of funds the government uses to help them get emergency like visas so they can work here, but they're not permanent. And then another part of that problem is that they pay taxes, but when they leave this country, they never get to claim their taxes. But the US government makes them seem like they are a burden to the country, you know, the encroachment, when really the largest immigration population in the United States is coming from Europe. And we should be concerned about that. According to the USDA, next year, for the first time in history, we as a country will be importing more agricultural goods than we export. So a little bit earlier, I talked about the inflation, the cost of food, the cost of gas. When we start importing all of these things, the cost is going to continue to go up. So we heard a lot yesterday about sustainability, food sovereignty, what we need to do to take care of things in our own backyard. Well, this is part of it. And I think the more that we can be sovereign and independent, starting with our own families, then the less strain we will feel from the inflation and what's happening when we go out and purchase things. I think everybody here is aware that there is what is called a convenient tax that the states and federal government uses. Every single time you go out of your house and you buy something, you are taxed. And I don't know if you ever look at your receipts, but sometimes there's taxes that go to some kind of local fee, there's county taxes, there's state taxes, and that money is collected immediately before you get your product, right? Those are called convenient taxes. So how much money of those convenient taxes go back into the local economy? It really doesn't. It goes back to those governments that are claiming those taxes. So I think, if you live in Rapid City and you're from one of the tribes, some of those taxes actually should be coming back to the tribes because this is your land. This is still territorial land, and it was never given up. There's this saying, and with treaty work, you use it or lose it, and you have to make these governments know, that you're paying taxes, you have every right, and you want to see it spent a certain way. You want to see it spent in your own communities. Then when there's implications of immigration and migration in South Dakota, I think the first one, everyone's feeling that already, and that's the expanding encroachment on Indian lands by way of federal funding and state policy making. So, when we get people, we always have the influx of immigrants coming in from foreign countries every time there's a war. So right now, the latest war was in the Ukraine, so we're seeing some immigrants coming from there. And they come to South Dakota and other places close to other Indian reservations, but they never consult the tribes. It's your land, or it's our land. Do we agree? I mean, do we have a say in that, or do we just continue to let that happen? And then there's immigration of foreign-born citizens to South Dakota that enforce the status quo. So when we look at some of the recent immigration, these are non-native people that are immigrating to the United States, and they want to be on their best behavior, right? They want to stay. And so they're going to go along with what the government tells them to go along with. And they don't really know what the concerns are of Indigenous people. We should find a way to communicate to them that, we feel encroached upon, and that we have to start working together so everybody can live happy in a more equitable way. So, and then also, the misuse and misinterpretation of South Dakota history regarding its Indigenous peoples and lands remains a problem. We need to really get in there and fix our own books, write our own books, first of all, and then correct the damage that's already been done. I don't know how many of you have looked at history books and what they teach about South Dakota. Everybody probably believes that there's no more Indians left, or that it was an image from the past. They don't know that the populations are vibrant, they're well, that we have some of the most brilliant people on the planet on Indian reservations. But the rest of the world, the rest of the country doesn't know that. We need to tell them that. They need to know we're here. Also, there's compounding complexities that diminish the work of the federal and state governments in tribal nations on climate change and environmental sustainability, primarily due to South Dakota's rapidly growing immigrant and migrant populations that depend on the federal government for support. So as long as these governments are being pulled in 100 different directions, then our concerns about climate and environment kind of sit on the back burner, because where is the money to address these issues? They always address the most immediate problem. And so right now that problem is with immigration. So we need to rethink, how do we get our voice in there? And I agree with Phil in terms of don't wait for the state to do it for you. I think that there's enough educated people in this room that we could make a change. I know the table that I'm sitting with, yesterday, all of the men at my table were saying we need action, right? And we don't want to keep talking about it. So we need to think about what that action looks like. And then there's also the implication of ignoring and exploiting migrants' ways of knowing regarding less invasive techniques in agriculture for profit. And what I mean by that, I talked a little bit earlier about a lot of our farm workers and industrial workers are coming from Mexico, Central and South America. Majority of those people are indigenous people, and they already have their own knowledge of how to work with the land. They prefer to work with the land and the soil with their own hands. And so we don't know to what extent they're traumatized by being paid to operate invasive, heavy equipment to rip up the earth. That's kind of it's contrary to their belief systems, but yet we do this because everybody needs to eat. Everybody is trying to make money. And so, but yet I talked earlier about the earth has feelings. The earth is very sensitive. Our people are very sensitive. And it doesn't matter what nation they come from. If they're indigenous, we have to rethink, how do we protect ourselves? We're being invaded almost on every single level, and we need to take care of each other and hopefully not have long-term impacts from that. But it sounds like we're not doing a good job of that. So, and this last slide kind of gets back into like what I'm about. I am, studied philosophy as my degree program. And I had a research question, what is the definition of wisdom? And I went to 5 different tribes and looked for answers. And they were all tribes that were not related to each other. And I did find that there were patterns and strains of all indigenous people. And all indigenous people will say that we are one people, that we were never divided by nations or borders or governments. And I think that type of thinking needs to get back to like where we're at today. So, and then we heard a lot from different scientists, and they have good work. I mean, they're informing us, but we're not part of that information on an equal basis. They still don't understand how we know what we know, which isn't coming out of books. As a child, your earliest teacher is your mother and your family, and you can watch how indigenous people respond to their environment. The environment and the earth contributes to your intelligence. And if you have that growing up, then you start to understand how you relate to everything that's living around you. Those things cannot be taught in a school or a book. Those things are taught from love, from being in close contact with people who love you and care about you. So there is a widely shared understanding that in our modern world, we have arrogantly and foolishly believed in science, a product largely of intellect alone and not of our whole being, as an instrument for imposing our will upon nature. And we see that over and over again with a lot of the testing, a lot of the measurements. Like everywhere you go, you have to prove something. Especially if you're native, you have to prove who you are, what you are, where you came from, all of this. That's not our way of doing things. And so, we're always pressed for having to prove that. I mean, it's ridiculous. And we're in our own country. It should be the other way around, right? And then in the relationship among people, Europeans and Americans have often assumed the right to impose their values and desires upon peoples whose lives are not yet based on the digital applications of science. And what I mean by that, a lot of our traditional people, older people and young people, have not totally embraced technology. It still is in contrast with how they think and how they feel. And if you push people too hard, they're going to resist even harder. I've traveled once recently with a woman who's Asian, and she thought that my technical skills weren't up to par, and she thought that they should be, and that by my having to depend on anybody to get me connected to the internet or any of the digital technology, that I was putting people out. And I had to explain to her that that's not how we see it. We each come to this on our own. It's not a competition. We're not trying to be the best techies out there. That's not what we do. And so, and with our older people, even my mom, she had trouble even with her remote control for her TV. And then I know with my grandmother, my mom's mother, when she passed, she said she didn't want to live to see man land on the moon, and she did not want to see when skyscrapers were built. She said, I'm not of that era. That's not my world. And we have to accept that people come from different worlds and that we can't all be in this competitive race toward technology and Western knowledge. And then lastly, as human beings, we see only things, entities, and events. We do not directly experience the forces and laws that govern the natural world. So yesterday we got to hear from Mr. Rick Two Dogs, Mr. Richard Moves Camps. We heard from Mr. Victor DeVille, and from Bill this morning about how Mr. Bill means about how we're part of this natural world, but do we really understand it? How do we know that it's part of us? How do we know how to be natural? Are we natural? You know, if you look at a tree or a rock, they're natural. There's no effort there. It's just, it just is. It's very simply just is. But for ourselves to say that we have to, it's a difficult task because our mind and our spirit has been bombarded with so many different things from different directions. So the whole idea of purification and slowing down, taking time to think, all of that is going to get us more connected to the natural world than trying to go out and grab things and understand it in a different way. Our people lived the way that they did for a reason. They were never in a hurry. They always made time for you. They always made time among themselves. And all of that was done so that we didn't lose that connection. We're spiritual beings, and then we're human beings, and then when we pass, we return back to our spiritual self. So none of that is ever communicated. And I think, you know, even we talk about, you know, our children, our grandchildren, what do we leave behind? You know, what is the first teaching? I think the first teaching is every morning you start your day with a prayer, because everything we do every day is sacred, even if you don't think that it is. But if it's in your consciousness that it is, then it is. It's just that simple. So, and then the other thing, the unseen world makes up indigenous science, also known as natural law. We must uphold this knowledge as equal to Western science. So when we have these hard conversations with scientists, they may never understand where we're coming from. They may never understand the spirit of everything that exists, that everything that's alive. But it's okay, we do. And we don't need to prove that. That's what makes it sacred. That's what gives us our connection to our natural law. We have to embrace that and not let that go. So that is my presentation. And some of you who don't know me, I just want to add one more thing, and I think Paula has a question, is when I was first doing treaty work, I was really young, about 1980. I was living in Little Eagle, South Dakota, and back then the treaty council was called the Black Hills Alliance. And then there was another treaty group called the Landowners Association on Standing Rock. And some of the elders back then were like David Spotted Horse, Mary Louise Defender, Dan Defender, Reginald Birdhorse, Joe Walker. They're all deceased except for Mary Louise, I believe. And they used to always bring me to these meetings and ask me to take notes. When Phil first met me, he asked me to take notes too. That was not too long ago. But anyway, so that's where my treaty career began. And then I didn't really understand it. But then when I started teaching Indigenous studies, I taught federal law for about 5 years. Then I started to teach about treaties. And I think treaties are a big part of everything that we do, and it should remain that way because it's our law. It's everything that our ancestors fought for. So I just wanted to end with that and give you a little bit of my background. So questions and answers, Paula.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for your information, and I had talked to Andrea about this before, but I guess this question is in general. And when I ask questions and comment on any of the presenters, I'm doing it just to spark interest and kind of brainstorm, because we're here to try to create ideas and conversations on climate change and what we're doing together as a people, right? And so, you know, in Alaska, there's villages that are no longer in existence. And the people that are there obviously have their own culture and their own traditions and the things they do to maintain their spirituality and their connection to Mother Earth and the Creator. And then villages are gone. And, this is a question for us in general. Where are them people? And now we have people who are being affected by hurricanes down in, like in Florida, the native people down there. They have the same thing. They have their connection to Mother Earth. They do their ceremonies. I'm sure they have their own sacred sites, just like the people in Alaska. When them people lose, I mean, they don't lose the connection. I think they talked about it yesterday where they're going to go back there someday. But in the meantime, as people, if we're all one, and we are, how are we going to support them people? Because like people in the Southwest, they're moving to the Dakotas and to the upper Midwest because it's too hot there. I've been talking for about 10 years about climate migration and refugees. How are we going to address that within the boundaries of the Oceti Sakowin? How are we going to address that as within the boundaries of the reservations? Are we going to be able to open our extend a handshake and ask, welcome these people who no longer have homes? And how is that going to affect our spirituality? Now they have no locations to do their ceremonies. How in the past, did our people welcome individuals or tribal members or even tribes or peoples, nations, whatever, to be able, because to me, any loss of a ceremony or a sacred site is going to affect all of us, because there's a balance across the world, like you're saying, and I really love your presentation about how, we're all interrelated. How are we going to maintain that spiritual balance, and what can we do? I just kind of, would like your comments, and that question is for every person in this room. How are we going to do that? Because there are going to be a lot of people moving inland, not only from land loss, the oceans are rising. What are we going to do as a people here? Because there are going to be so many people moving inward. How are we going to address that? There's going to be good and bad, Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Paula, for your comment. There's a couple of things, I think that with the indigenous people that are dislocated, I think it is, we should be the first people to respond to them and to reach out for them. And if we're not able to do it in a physical way, then we can sure offer prayers and direction for where they go. A lot of indigenous people don't want to leave their homelands. It's not ideal for them to leave, like the swamplands in Louisiana, to come and live in the Midwest on the plains. It just doesn't. And Dr. Cluck yesterday talked about the migration of the people from the south to the north because of rising temperatures. But if you're an indigenous person from the Southwest, that hot weather is not a problem. The people there have adapted to high climate. They use food for one, and they use, certain teas that they drink to keep their body cool, and how their houses were built at one time kept them cool. So ideally, most indigenous people would not take that path. I think he was talking about non-indigenous people, but he didn't have his data segregated by race. So we're just assuming that people from the Southwest want to come here. So I know, Bill, you had your hand up?
Yes, true. Quick here, coming around. One last question is, Mike, there's a very dangerous way. You mentioned teaching and various ways of manipulating what we learn. There's a policy here in the state of South Dakota is very dangerous. It's called critical race theory, which is another way of saying that we're only going to teach you things we want you to learn. In other words, they want to revise everything. They don't want to teach anybody about treaties. They don't want to teach anybody about the cultural ways of Lakota and the difference between Lakota and Washuchus. So I just wanted to bring that up because a lot of people in here, our teachers, are involved in education. And we got to fight for the right to tell the truth. They try to edit us out of existence in the public education of the United States, but we can't let them do that. Oceti.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a really great book out there called Critical Race, Through the Lens, The White Racial Frame by Joe Fagan, who is a national leader on racial inequalities. And in his book, it opens up with the foundation of this country was built on stolen Indian lands, and the wealth came from the back of black slaves. And so I used that book in my social justice class to my students, and my white students had never heard of it before, and they were embarrassed by it and they were hurt by it, but emotionally we connected, and most of them were willing to take the responsibility, to make that right. And I think that by not talking about it, we don't do anything about it. And I think the real racial issue really needs to happen among white people because it's their problem and not ours. What we could do is offer them the different texts and books to read to catch up to like where we're at. But in our prayers when we say Omitakiase, that includes it includes all races of people. So a lot of times we have to meet them where they're at. Claude?
Yes. Claude Trudeau. Istanbul Lakota Treaty Council. One of the short, I try to make it short because a lot of people know I can talk. And what my concern is that, when we pray, we have the awareness of the 6 directions when we pray with our sacred Shanupa. What the concern we have, the elders have been shaken in their shoes when it comes to our young people today with the an extreme amount of alcohol and drug abuse, that there's so much fear in our own communities. So the 7th direction is yourself. You need to address yourself. We need to address ourselves to become aware. If we love who we are and we love our way of life, then we need to address who we are. We need to start strengthening who we are individually. We need to find that concept and find that right road. When we walk this red road, we find what grandpas have said. When you pick up this pipe, people are going to spit on you. They're going to throw rocks at you. They're going to tell you that, who do you think you are? And I know, I started a book in 1991, and it's called Return to the Center. We're coming back to the center of our circle. And to do that, and there's a lot of things that you have to do. Forgiving yourself, forgiving others. Who today can learn how to forgive our perpetrators, what they've done to us? And we always run to alcohol and drug to numb that historical trauma. So I believe, the traumas we have to address to get our healthy nation back. One of the things that I feel like young people should go into, and it's a small, vocational thing probably, A lot of us have problems with our washers and dryers. When a washer goes out or dryer goes out, we have when we buy these things from stores here in Rapid or Sioux Falls or Pierre, it says 5-year warranty or 10-year warranty, and we can't get it fixed because somewhere along the line they're going to keep postponing the whatever for 5 months, 6 months, and finally, you can get tired of waiting for your washer and dryer to be fixed. Why can't we have some of our young people go in that direction to fix our washers and dryers that we can, and it's so far away from the communities that, to get our washer and dryer fixed. So these are the concerns that, and I'd like to ask the young people to go, some of these, I don't know, vocational schools offer that type of training, but a lot of things that we have that we need good uh, repairmen or whatever to help us in that direction. So I appreciate your comments. I like, I told my nephew here, I said, I like her.
Thank you.
But I like what you're sharing. I like the, the data, some of the things that I grew up with, Wola Kota. And Wola Kota, I'm glad that I grew up that way. I grew up with my language. And I feel very blessed that I was raised that way. And so I want to thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, I agree with you. The self-sufficiency needs to happen on all levels, whether it's, fixing our appliances, growing our own food, working on our cars, everything that makes us, function from day to day. I want to leave one last thing for the youth, for the parents that have small children and young adults and everybody else in between. Every night we go to bed, and when we are asleep, we're fasting from food and water. You can teach your young people that they're about ready to go on a fast. If they could smudge, purify, take a shower or something before they go to bed, and know that they are going on a journey when they're asleep. It's the same parallel to when you go up on the hill and fast. When you're up there, you're fasting from food and water. You're praying for dreams. You're praying for answers. That's how we used to go to bed at night. And now people fall asleep in front of the TV or with their headsets on and all that. All of that needs to come off. So a lot of the things that we could teach our young people are very basic things. And, if we can keep things simple, then we can return back to our natural selves quicker. Thank you. I was happy to be here with you, and I'm happy to see everybody today.
Wopila tanka. Alewana wichoka wotaktacha. Toshka Henry Wochiki Wachiwa yena Transhi Royal Olon Aheoki Woite Olon. Ila Wopila Agana Ogana IRE leaders ki IRE councilman ki lo chimna chichi. Aho, wopila trankaela. Lunch is open. The plates start on that side, and I'm sure the treaty man is hungry too. So working on the treaties is hard work. It makes you hungry. I'm very proud of my nephew there, Henry, and Matranshi Royal Yellowhawk. These are young men that have carried on the spiritual ways, the traditional ways. A lot of the old spiritual leaders have left us, and but now it's their turn, our turn to step up and